Welcome to the podcast, guys. My name is Wolfie, and normally I have another creator with me by the name of Emerald. Unfortunately, I did just do a stream. God damn it, truck. I will put in a warning. I am not a clean mouth. I'm a very dirty mouth person, so is Emerald. And this, I will put trigger warnings because this is very graphic, very dark. So I would suggest that if you aren't comfortable with sexual themes or gory descriptions or anything like that, I would recommend clicking off right now. However, if you are a fellow true crime fan like me, then I would suggest you get warm, bundle up, maybe have some coffee or tea, cuddle a puppy, and let's begin. But yeah, like I said, we did stream. I messed up. That was my fault. I forgot to put the audio capture, output capture, so that you could hear the other person. So today it's just me doing my own. And then Thursday we'll also have another episode. And yeah. So let's get started, shall we? I'm going to try to talk about everything. I'm going to also quote my sources. Sam and Colby, they're another channel here on YouTube. Shout out to them. They are amazing. I love their channel. They did go to the house. They talked to the groundskeeper there, and they have a lot of information. Also, the Des Moines Register has information as well, and I'm also using the Smithsonian magazine as well. So those are my sources. And let me grab a cough drop. I apologize for my voice. This is not usually how it sounds. But I did get sick. So the title of this podcast is We Didn't Plan for This, because I just randomly went to Emerald and I said, hey, do you want to do a true crime podcast? She said yes. We jumped into this without planning shit. So that's where we are. Now, we are going to talk about the VIllisca Axe Murder that took place on June 9th, 1912. Technically June 8th, but it was actually almost 112 years ago. Now, this year will mark the 112th. This crime has been unsolved. So, VIllisca, if you don't know, is in Iowa. It's actually 100 miles southwest from Des Moines, Iowa, which actually my dad and his family are from. God rest his soul. Unfortunately, I can't talk to him about this. He has since passed. But, alright, so here we have the victims. And the victims are what makes this truly, truly sad. Because 6 of them were children. The oldest one only being 12, and the youngest was only 5 years old. They didn't have a chance to even live their lives. They were just learning about the world. So, there was Josiah Moore and Sarah Moore, which, if I go... Josiah Moore was 43. I haven't seen how old his wife was yet. So, Josiah was 43. I believe, if I remember correctly, seeing it in the many, many news articles and everything that I have read, I believe Sarah Moore was like 37. Then we have, and I'm going to go in order, not who was whose, but in order of age. So there was Lena Stillinger, who was 12, Herman Moore, who was 11, Catherine Moore, who was 10, Ena Stillinger, who was 8, Boyd Moore, who was 7, Paul Moore, who was 5. Now, Josiah Moore, and especially Sarah Moore, was very well known in the community. Josiah was a very prominent businessman, and he was a very well known church worker as well as Sarah Moore. And actually, Sarah Moore had put on a program at the local Presbyterian church. It was the Children's Day something. Hold on, let me find it again. I apologize. I had a whole lot of notes and then I found it. Yeah, it was a Children's Day service held at VIllisca's Presbyterian Church. All the Moore kids, along with Lena and Ina Stillinger, played prominent parts in it. Okay, so keep that in mind for later. Now, one thing to note is that at this point in time, VIllisca City was actually in a feud with the power company over wages and working conditions. And so the power company had actually shut off the power that night. So it was very dark when the family returned to the house around 9:45 to 10 p.m. And because of this, Lena and Ina Stillinger did not want to walk home in the dark. They were scared. And so they ended up staying the night at the Moore's house. And that's the truly sad part. Like, it's sad any other way you look at it, but if this had been any other night, those two children would have been saved. They would not have been there that night. So, moving on to the actual crime scene, around midnight or after midnight. And here's my theory. I think the killer was in the attic. Because the axe was from the family's backyard, and there were cigarette butts found inside the closet in the children's room. So I definitely think he was in the attic. Like, how would he have, gotten in undetected anyways? So nobody heard a sound. Nobody heard the murders happen. Nobody knew until the next morning. Allegedly, the parents were killed first, and then the Moore children, and then the Stillinger children. And he is believed to have gone around twice because there was a shoe at the end of the Moore parents' bed that had been full of blood and was tipped over and blood was pooling out. Everybody is to have been killed with the blunt end of the axe except for Sarah Moore. She was hit with the blade, and each victim was struck 20 to 30 times. All the mirrors and windows had been covered. And actually, if you look at photographs and videos today of the house, in the parents' and the Moore children's bedroom, there are still gouges on the ceiling from the blade of the axe from when he was swinging up. And when investigators actually went into the house, there was a circle of gouge marks that was seen as if the killer took his axe and swung it into a circle, like in a celebratory or a frenzy. So the bodies and heads were covered with linen or bedcloths. And here's where it gets, the story is already twisted enough, but here's where it gets even worse. Lena Stillinger, she was 12. She was the oldest of all the children. Her nightgown had been pushed up and her undergarments had been taken off. She'd been exposed with a lamp positioned between her legs at the foot of the bed. She was not sexually assaulted, but she was sexually posed, and there was a bloody handprint on her knee. And in that same room, the axe was found leaning up against a wall with either a 2-pound or a 4-pound slab. There's different accounts of bacon that had seminal fluid on it. So that's the crime scene. The Moore children and the parents were upstairs, and Lena Stillinger and Ina Stillinger were downstairs in the guest bedroom. So the next morning, one of the neighbors, which the Des Moines Register, I believe, I forget where I found it. But one source quoted Mary Peckham as being the neighbor, but I'm not entirely sure. Let's see. I haven't actually looked through. Yeah, I can't find where I found it, but they went over, the neighbor went over, knocked, got no response, tried looking in the windows on the door and other windows, couldn't see anything because they were all covered. So she called Rossmore, who was Josiah's brother. He actually had keys. He came over, tried knocking, and didn't get a response. Tried looking through the windows again, didn't see anything. He eventually unlocked the door and later instructed the neighbor to call the police. So the marshal at the time was Henry Horton, and he is quoted having said that somebody was killed in every bed. Now, once the crime scene was discovered, the police did not do a good job, and this really speaks to the time period that it happened in. And also the door being locked was really weird because at that time hardly anybody locked their doors. It really speaks volumes to the small community and just how much different of a time period it was. But the town was allowed to trample through the crime scene. They were allowed to touch the murder weapon. So any DNA, any evidence that may have been collected, I know that the Golden State Killer was actually found through DNA evidence years later. I think just recently, in fact, not very recently, but in recent times, was found through familial DNA. And so just, if there had been DNA, because the killer sat down and ate a meal. That's another thing. The killer sat down and ate a meal, and there was bloody water as if he had washed his hands. So any DNA that we could have collected that could have possibly been used years down the line, it's just gone. And that's one thing. I don't think that this case is ever going to be solved. I think we are going to be constantly wondering who did it, asking. I think this is a story that our children, our grandchildren, our great grandchildren, and so on, are going to look at and ask, what happened? Who did it? Who could have taken the lives of these children? That is going to be a question for decades. So now we're going to get on to our suspects, which, our first suspect is going to be Reverend Lynn George Jacqueline Kelly, who was known to be very mentally unstable. He was known to be a peeping Tom and had also frequently tried to elicit sexual favors from women. And actually, let me find it again. There was, here it is. So, in one thing to note was that the killer was left-handed, and Reverend Lynn George Kelly was also left-handed. And in 1914, he was living in Winner, South Dakota. He advertised for a girl stenographer to do confidential work, and that ad, which was placed in the Omaha World Herald, and this is directly from the Smithsonian if you want to go look it up, would also specify that the candidate must be willing to pose as model. A young woman named Jessamine Hodgson responded, and she received a letter in return, which was described by a judge as so obscene, lewd, lascivious, and filthy as to be offensive to this honorable court, and improper to be spread upon the record thereof. But amongst his milder instructions, Reverend Kelly told Hodgson that she would be required to type in the nude. Now, he was a prime suspect because at 5:19 in the morning of after the murder, before the bodies were discovered, which they were discovered around 8, 9, 10. We don't know. It was sometime after that, which it was, not early, but it was early enough that, people noticed that the Moors weren't up doing what they typically did. So 5:19 in the morning, Reverend Kelly gets on the train to leave VIllisca, and he apparently told a couple, about 8 dead souls who were butchered in their beds. But the bodies hadn't been discovered yet. Hold on one second. I am so sorry for coughing in your ear. I've still got a little bit of cold. He was later seen mailing a bloody shirt to Omaha for cleaning, and he actually confessed to the murder. And when he confessed, he said a shadowy figure had called to him, given him the axe, brought him to the house, and forced him to kill. And heard as clear as a voice from God said, "Peter, slay and eat." And actually, there is, on the Smithsonian, it actually says something different. So this just could be word of mouth, that kind of thing. But in his confession, he stated, "I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to my mind, and I picked up the axe, went into the house, and killed them." Now, he was tried. He was charged and tried for the murder. But he later recanted his statement, and the couple who claimed to have spoken to him actually changed their story. So, with little left to tie him to the killings, the grand jury, the first one to hear his case, hung 11-1 in favor of refusing to indict him, and a second one freed him. So, that's our first suspect. The next one was Frank F. Jones. But, now I gotta scroll back up because I only have limited information from different sources, but I just found the Smithsonian today, so I apologize. Now, the second one was Frank F. Jones, who was a local businessman and state senator at the time. So there were two reasons as to why he was a suspect. Now, there was an intense hatred between Frank Jones and Josiah Moore. First, Josiah Moore had worked for him for 7 years, becoming the star salesman of Jones's farm equipment business, but Josiah Moore had left, probably because of his boss's insistence on the hours of 7 a.m. to 11 p.m. 6 days a week. And, so they became business rivals. And it was also believed that he had slept with Senator Jones's daughter-in-law, who was well known in the town for her numerous affairs, because she had a astonishingly indiscreet habit of arranging her tryst over the telephone when, at that time, all calls in VIllisca had to be placed through an operator, and they could just hit a button and listen in. So, And by the time of the murder, the relationship between Jones and Moore had grown so cold that they began to cross the street to avoid each other, which this is a small community. Like, to actually cross the street to avoid walking near somebody is pretty insane in that small of a town. So, but there were few in VIllisca that believed that Frank F. Jones was 57 when the murders were committed, so there were a lot of people that didn't believe he swung the axe himself. So there was a theory by by someone named James Wilkerson, um, who said that Jones had hired somebody by the name of William Mansfield to murder Josiah Moore. Now, the reason this was theorized is because there was evidence on Mansfield that in 1914 he was the chief suspect of the Axe murders of his wife, her parents, and his own child in Blue Island, Illinois. Now, unfortunately, the reason this theory didn't pan out is because Mansfield turned out to have a cast iron alibi for the VIllisca killings, because payroll records showed that he had been working several hundred miles away in Illinois at the time. So there was that. The last one is going to be someone by the name of Paul Mueller. Paul Mueller was known as the man on the train, which there is actually a book about him. He was a prolific serial killer, killing whole families while utilizing the railway system in America. He was a German immigrant and was said to have been a very skilled man. And it all started one night on January 7th, 1898. Now, Paul Mueller had been living with a farmer named Newton, and that particular night, Newton had neighbors over. They, had a couple drinks, Newton paid back what he owed, that kind of thing. And later that night, they saw Paul walking to the train. The neighbors did. They called out to Paul, said, "Hey, Paul," and they got no response. A couple days later, the farmer that Paul had lived with were found killed, he and his family, killed with the blunt end of an axe and covered with bed sheets. Now, Paul Mueller was known to have killed around 59 people in 14 different incidents, and his killings were very similar to VIllisca. All the families were covered with bed sheets. The axe was always at the scene of the crime, like picked up there. I believe the girls were always sexually posed, that kind of thing. Like, there's just too many similarities for me to say that it was the Reverend, because even at that time, I don't think police are publishing all the details of the killings. And so, I definitely think that it was Paul Mueller. But I don't think anybody can say for sure. So, definitely not. I don't think it's ever going to be solved, but I definitely think that it was Paul Mueller, the man on the train. But let me know what you guys think. I'd love to hear your theories on this, if you've heard of it, everything like that. This case has stuck with me for a very long time, and I wish that I don't think there's ever going to be a solve it. I mean, even by now, the killer's long dead. This happened back in 1912. It's now 2024. I actually had to look because my mind still thinks it's 2023. So, yeah. Thank you guys for listening, and I really hope that you guys have a wonderful day. Stay safe. Don't get murdered.